And now it's beginning broadcast.
Great. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you all for joining us today. Today's program we are hosting in partnership with the George W. Bush Institute, which is located in Dallas, Texas. And we will be having a conversation with two of its researchers on democracy and why it is still the best governing system, despite the challenges that's posed by this pandemic. My name is Xiaoyan Zhao. I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Kentucky and Southern Indiana. We are a hub for international exchange, dialogue, and learning located in Louisville, Kentucky. As a member of two national networks, Global Ties US and the World Affairs Councils of America, we facilitate a variety of international professional and youth exchanges, many through the US Department of State. And we provide speaker programs and educational opportunities for the Kentuckiana region throughout the year. While we are a member-supported organization, we are not member-exclusive in our programs, which means that the public is welcome to all of our programming opportunities. We are committed, especially during this time, to ensure that you still have access to expert analysis and discussions on topics that impact us locally, nationally, and globally during this global pandemic. So the title of today's program is Choosing Freedom in the Time of the COVID-19, Democratic and Authoritarian Approaches to the Pandemic and What Comes After. It is a topic that many of us probably have thought about during the last few months and may be questioning, especially as our country begins to open up. We have two researchers from the George W. Bush Institute's Human Freedom Initiative to help us shed some light on this conversation based on their research today. So joining us today from the Institute are Lindsay Lloyd, the Bradford M. Freeman Director of the Human Freedom Initiative, and Nicole Bibbins Sedeca, Human Freedom Fellow at the Bush Institute. Lindsay manages original research and programmatic efforts to advance freedom and democracy in the world, which includes the Freedom and Democracy Project to support US leadership in the world and re-energize our democracy at home, and the Freedom in North Korea Project to raise awareness of human rights violations in North Korea, propose new policy solutions, and engage leaders to help improve the lives of the North Korean people. Nicole serves as the chair for the Global Politics and Security Concentration in Georgetown University's Master of Science in Foreign Service program. She has previously served in the US Department of State, working on democracy promotion, human rights, human trafficking, religious freedom, refugees, and counterterrorism. Following her governmental service, she opened and directed the International Republican Institute's local governance program in Ecuador. So welcome to both of you today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. Before we begin, I'm just going to do a quick reminder about the functionalities and the run of show today. This webinar is recorded and live streamed on Facebook. We will provide a link to the recording after the program. We will have about 30 minutes of conversation, which may include some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time. And then after our conversation, we will go into Q&A. Please note that you can submit questions at any time during this conversation. We will collect them all and answer as many of them as we can. If you prefer, you can ask a question verbally. You just raise your hand in your controls in the bottom and we will unmute you. So let's begin. Why don't we start with Lindsay? If you can set the stage for us by telling us a little bit more about the Bush Institute, what the work does, what the Institute does, and basically what brought us here today. Lindsay?
Sure, happy to. Wish we were there in person, but delighted to join with you virtually. The George W. Bush Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan institution. We're on the campus of SMU, Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. And we're in the same building as President Bush's presidential library. All of the records from his time in Washington, as well as his time as governor of Texas, are located in there and are run by the National Archives. They're owned by the American people now. We work on the back side of the building, which is the Institute, which is, as I said, a nonprofit, and we focus on policy priorities of George and Laura Bush throughout their careers. So we have programs in economics, we have programs on education, on military service, veterans, and what we work on, which we call human freedom, which is our democracy and human rights portfolio. We don't accept any government money. It's all privately funded. And as I say, we work on different challenges, both sort of think tank work and also more action oriented. You mentioned our work in North Korea. We also have a program, for example, that trains up and coming leaders from Burma. So it's a combination of more action oriented and more thought research, traditional think tank work. Can't hear you.
Okay, technology again. Nicole, if you can tell us about the report, the title of which we are borrowing for this talk, Choosing Freedom. That's the kind of the basis for this conversation today. What was the question that you were asking, seeking to answer, and what are some of your findings?
Excellent. First off, thank you for having us. It's a great pleasure to be here. We would love to have been in Louisville, but we're happy to be with you and your colleagues online. So our report, Choose Freedom, which is about revitalizing American support and leadership for supporting democracy and human rights around the world, really sought to answer the question, what should the role of the United States be in supporting other people outside of the United States who want to have the very freedoms that we have in the United States? It's actually been a question that's already been answered for many, many decades, because presidents on both sides of the aisle, administrations on both sides of the aisle for many, many decades have had support for democracy and human rights, and the courageous people who are seeking human rights and democracy overseas has been a cornerstone of American foreign policy. We've seen that receding a little bit recently, and we've seen that receding at the same time that there have been more challenges in the world to democracy and challenges to human rights around the world. Freedom House, which is an NGO that focuses on democracy support, has reported that there's 14 consecutive years of regression, of backsliding in democracy around the world. And so this report is really an encouragement, a call to action, if you will, to Americans across the board, in government, outside of government, faith-based organizations, civic organizations, political leaders, and others, to say it's all of our responsibility to support democracy, and that it's not just in the interest of the people in other countries, it's really in the interest of the United States and the American people, and that it's not just about supporting, but it is also about the United States leading in this area.
So that's very helpful, because we also know that you did this, this report was done before this pandemic came out, and you were going to different cities and talking about your findings and the role of the American values of democracy in our foreign policy. In light of the crisis that we're currently in, do you see or feel, or has any of the things that you all found may have changed? Are they still relevant in what we see, how different countries are responding to the pandemic?
It's a great question. And it's actually the question I think that all people should be asking is, how does this pandemic reevaluate what we're thinking about? With each passing day, as we get more news about all of the responses to this pandemic, it becomes clearer and clearer that democracy is more and more important around the world. You know, people have asked, what's the difference between democracies or authoritarian governments in responding to the pandemic? And maybe it just doesn't even matter. What I hear quite often is when people think about specific actions, maybe handing out a vaccine or passing an ordinance that says you need to stay in your house at these times of the day, some of those things are things which we know that authoritarians and democracies can do. But truthfully, the response to a pandemic, a response to something as serious as what we're facing right now, is not just a single action. It is an entire system of response. And it starts with individuals or individual scientists, individual people who are inflicted with this disease, start to report to their government. We have a concern. We know that this is an issue which is emerging. And it is only in democracies that we see governments responding consistently to citizens' needs, because in democracies is where we see governments see that their responsibility is to respond to citizens' needs. And it is where there's that open line of communication and the government is responsive to citizens' needs, where you're best able then to not just do the tactical decisions, which are very important, but to look at a comprehensive response. But it's also in democracies where it's the only place where we see the media is able to report openly. The government can't silence the people who are raising concern. They can't silence the media that's reporting on it. And there are checks and balances when the government doesn't do its job well. And that's a really important part of what democracies have to offer when we have these very serious challenges at home and abroad, is you want an entire system which can rise to the challenge of having open communication, transparent response, checks and balances to ensure that the response is as good as it can be. And that's where we see a huge difference between democracies and authoritarian governments.
I could just add, I mean, there's been a lot of talk that authoritarian countries have responded better or more quickly to this global crisis, and there's just no evidence for that. You know, you look at a place like Russia, you look at a place like Iran, both of which have suffered, I would say, above average, you know, from this pandemic, and their response there is, you know, as Nicole said, there's no transparency to it. Citizens don't know what's going on. The media cannot report freely on it. We've seen some democracies have done better, some have done worse. You know, we've obviously had issues here in the United States in terms of how we've responded to this crisis. But other societies, other democratic societies have really coped quite well. Places like South Korea, places like Taiwan, Canada, Austria, others have been able to rise to the challenge. Others, Italy has had, you know, a much tougher road here. So I think at the end of the day, though, Nicole's point is absolutely right, that democratic societies in the long run are going to come out of this ahead of authoritarian or autocratic societies.
So I think that's a really important point, looking at the variations even between these two extreme type of regimes. Some do better, some, it's very hard to kind of really say which black and white, you know, democratic and authoritarian, but on the whole, you're suggesting that democracies are certainly better at handling this in the long term. And I think you also mentioned before, Nicole, about the strength of the institutions, how they affect that country's ability. And I just wonder, you know, with crises like these, do they create opportunities for institutional change? Does it reinforce some of the existing structures or governance systems, or does it weaken them? For example, we've been tested right now in the US with some of these.
Absolutely. I mean, I think times of crisis for individuals as well as systems and governing systems show the strength and weakness of response. And I think we see that in our own country, but we see that throughout the world, is how well do each of the individual institutions rise to what their full mandate is during a time of challenge. I do think it shows where we have weaknesses in the system, and I think it is a great opportunity for democracies to look where they can continue to strengthen their institutions, and it shines a light on authoritarian governments to show where their systems definitively break down or don't have the institutions to do these things. You know, you mentioned that democracies will show in the long run. I think we're seeing it in the short run and in the long run. But another thing which we will see in the long run is that the limitations which many governments have put in place. Many of us are at home right now. Many of us are wearing masks to the grocery store. What we'll see in the long run as well is how will civil liberties and political liberties fare in the long run? And you'll see a stark difference between democracies and authoritarian governments in this place. There will be limitations that will be put on people in democracies. There are limitations which are directly related to the societal good in that moment, but they will eventually be lifted when we're not in a time of crisis. I think what we will see in the longer term in authoritarian regimes is a significant overreach of the limitations that will be put in place, and fewer of those rolled back, once we get out of this time of crisis. And that also is a difference, and that is a difference which is a reflection of the strength of the institutions. The institutions know that they will need to return to a point of full flourishing after this crisis, and we will see how that will play out in the longer run.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, in terms of technology, you know, there's a lot of discussion about contact tracing, how important it is to know that if you become ill, who have you seen, who have you met with, who have you encountered? Some of the authoritarian countries, especially China, are, you know, miles ahead in terms of developing that kind of software, putting it on your phone so that the government, you know, knows, okay, you went to this store, you were in this building kind of thing. But I have a great deal of skepticism that when the all clear signal comes, that China's just going to turn that switch off. Of course they're not. You know, this is another tool in their already formidable arsenal of how they control and watch people there. I'd feel a lot more comfortable if it were the government of, say, Taiwan implementing such a system, because the Taiwanese government isn't out to track every move, every thought of its population. So technology can be a good or a bad thing, depending on the context, but ultimately democracies are going to be the ones that are going to protect civil liberties and political freedoms.
So you bring a really interesting point, which is, you know, using that example of contact tracing. It'll work only if it's done by everybody, right? It has, you have to, individuals and citizens have to be willing to give up a certain level of privacy. But can it be effective if it is voluntary? And in what conditions can you make it so that majority of people are willing to do it? And you mentioned the difference between, you know, say in Taiwan, a government can impose it, but its populace will be willing to do it for the most part. But even now, where we are in the US, you know, talking about masks, you can't really impose something like this. How effective can it be in these kinds of, you know, crisis situations where you have this kind of a tug of, you know, privacy and freedom versus, you know, a level of control?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think in a free society like ours, you're going to see a lot of reluctance for people to do it. We already have a fairly deep and deepening cleavage in the United States about how serious a threat this is and whether it truly is safe to go back to work, back to school, and so on. On the other hand, people are generally very comfortable giving away all kinds of data to platforms like Google or Facebook or others, where they don't think twice about it, and, you know, different apps that follow your every move, you know, whether you're aware of it or not. But I do agree. I mean, I think it's going to be a real challenge to get anything close to sort of universal acceptance of that kind of tracking, especially in a society like ours. And it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. You have to rely on goodwill, which is often in short supply in our country these days.
Yeah. Let me just add another point, which is democracy is in large part built also on trust and legitimacy of leadership, which means that the leadership, whether that's at the national, local, state level, because they are in transparent dialogue, or should be in transparent dialogue with their citizens, they are building trust in the citizens, and they're establishing their legitimacy by saying, we're responding to what we hear. And when there's a difference of view or different of opinion on a policy, that leader is able to explain why that happens. That's not something you see in authoritarian governments. It's something that you see in democracies. But it is that trust and that legitimacy, which is a much stronger foundation for a society than when people are doing things, having no idea why it's being done, feeling that it's completely imposed on them. And so this is an opportunity where leaders are able to build that trust, are able to use those transparent open communications of dialogue to not impose in the sense, but to invite citizens to join what our communal responsibility is right now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic. I recently read a great article about that really how well countries are dealing with it is really because, you know, in terms of how citizens accept the controls that's imposed on them, it really depends on how much they control, or they can accept that authority from their governments. And I guess you can say that from both sides. You know, in democracies, we have this ability to have elections and change this out when you do no longer have trust. And then in authoritarian regimes, you don't have that kind of regular check. How about just looking at this more historically? I think, Nicole, you've brought this up in the past when we talked about this, about how this compares to post 9/11 in terms of the privacy, you know, restrictions and these kinds of issues that popped up. And has many of those things that was put on during that time, have they gone away? Do we know what happened?
Yeah, I think that there's some parallels that can be drawn. They're obviously not in any way exact same situations, but I think it's important to note much of the conversation about how did we know post 9/11 that the limitations which were put on by the government were the right ones. And many of the same measures that we used then, I think are ones that we can use now. Are they directly related to the threat? Do we know that the limitations that are put on us are directly related? Lindsay talked about the tracking that the Chinese government is doing on citizens. We see that far exceeds the amount of tracking that's needed to actually keep track of people related to COVID specifically. Secondly, is there transparent and open articulation of policies so that people who are impacted, who may have their civil liberties limited for a short period of time, can understand why that's being done? And then the last piece is, last two pieces, are there checks and balances on those restrictions? Are there other entities within the government, other democratic institutions, which can say to a leader, we're just going to check to make sure that what you're doing is directly related and you're not overstepping? And then last, the point that I mentioned earlier, do those limits go away when the crisis goes away? And that's an important part. And so we have to really look, you know, able to draw some of those lessons somewhat from 9/11. Are the limitations needed and directly related to the crisis? Are they well explained? Are they checked by other democratic institutions that have the interests of the citizens? And then do they go away when we no longer need to limit people's movement or limit people's activities because the crisis itself has gone?
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, in the case of some of the post 9/11 legislation that was enacted, things like the Patriot Act, certain methods of surveillance and so forth, they've been overturned either by Congress or courts at various points. So again, it's having that, you know, that we are so lucky to have the Constitution that we have, to have the independent branches of government, to have a media that can go out and ask the tough questions. And in some cases where there was government overreach, it's been dialed back, which is precisely how it should be.
And let me add on that point, and Lindsay makes an excellent point. Democracy doesn't guarantee that everything will go perfectly. I wish it did. If there was a way to do that, you know, we could certainly bottle that up. What democracy does guarantee when it is in its strongest form is that there will be checks and balances, and there will be dialogue about how things are going. And that is what's most important. I think a lot of people expect, we live in a democracy, everything should be perfect. Everything should be delivered when I want it, how I want it. But that's not what a democracy promises to do. What it promises to do is hear the voices, have responsive government, have limitations and clear lines of authority, so that that debate in a society can happen and the best public policies can come out of that. So the debate and the rigor and the discussion about things is actually a sign of strong democracy when it's done well and it's done in the public interest. And so that's an important thing to think about when we are talking about how do we see democracy in this time.
So kind of related to what you just said, you know, a lot of it is really perceptions right now. Globally, what the perceptions are. You know, we have, the US have not been really in a leadership position in a lot of these international global kind of a cooperative efforts. What are your thoughts about what's at stake in terms of, you know, one thing is the US has always been equated and projected the strength of democracies, and yet we're not really taking a leading role in these international efforts. Where are we going in that, and what's the danger of that? Because Russia, China, these big other powers are coming in with very different models, and the perception may be that that's a strong and effective model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just say to start off, and the nature abhors a vacuum, and when there is a vacuum, other countries, Russia, China, as you mentioned, will fill that vacuum. The global architecture, which kind of ruled the world for 70 plus years, was largely an American creation. Things like the United Nations or the World Bank, or any of dozens of other international organizations, were created primarily by the U.S. to prevent wars like World War II from ever happening again. And gradually, as countries became independent during decolonization, they joined up, they engaged in this international order. And we have, in many ways, sort of turned our backs on what we created. And that's allowed our adversaries, countries like Russia and China, to sort of seize the mantle of leadership. I don't think at the end of the day, the Chinese or Russian model is going to be particularly attractive for a lot of people around the world. But you're right, they're out there selling it, they're promoting it. China can at least make a claim that they're doing well economically, that they're a rising, prosperous country. A little harder for Russia to do. But we, back in the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan got on the stage and said, the West, the United States, needs to present and promote our values in the same way that our adversaries, the Soviet Union, are doing. We need to talk about why our system is better, why it guarantees prosperity, or at least enables prosperity for people, and enables people to live freely. And we've sort of forgotten that. It's a long-standing bipartisan tradition, but we need to get back to it. We need to go out there and talk about and act in ways that support the development of democracy and the promotion of human rights around the world.
Yeah. And so it's not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do for the American people, right? If we live in a world in which the values that have worked in our country are the values that govern the rest of the world, respect for different people of different groups, the ability for people to participate in their society and have their voice heard, and have the hand of aggressive, violent actors restrained by effective governance. That is a world in which the United States has the best playing field to advance its economic interests, its security interests, its political interests. And it's the right thing to do for us to stand with people who deeply and courageously long to live with the same freedoms that we have in this country. And I think there are many people who have thought, well, this whole international architecture is just this big bureaucracy, and if we don't engage, then who cares, let someone else. But as Lindsay's pointing out, who engages and who leads will have a very strong impact on what that system looks like. And we don't want to live in a world that is led by the values and the systems that China or Russia would put in place if they were to have the opportunity. And it would be great to say that the United States could step back and that all of the values that have been there for decades would continue, but that's not clear. And it's most likely, I'm almost certain that they won't continue. And so US leadership is needed more now than ever. And what we also see is when the United States leads, many countries will follow. And that's an important point. And what we hear consistently from activists around the world is, we need you to the United States. There's a lot in the news today about Hong Kong and the people who've been in the streets for months, courageously standing up for the very freedoms. And what they did in the early days is they had American flags and they asked for the United States to stand with them for freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. And it is because they know when the United States leads, the rest of the world will follow.
Great. Well, we're going to go into Q&A very soon, but
Great.
Before we do that, while everybody else who's on the call, if you can go ahead and start putting in your questions at this time. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to ask Lindsay and Nicole to just give some closing thoughts in terms of really thinking about this in the November elections, right? That's something that a lot of us are really thinking of. And we probably could see very different approaches to our foreign policy depending on what the outcome is going to be. So if you can just you know, give us some thoughts on that. What do you think that's going to, what the outcome might hold? And, you know, the last couple of years, we've really kind of stepped back from this global leadership. Have we stepped back far enough that it's going to take some time to get back into the field, or do we still have plenty of time and goodwill out there to be able to take that leadership role back again? So maybe we start with Nicole, and then.
Yeah, I think it's never too late for anything. It's never too late when you're talking about fighting for the rights that we all enjoy on a daily basis. So let me make 2 points on that. One, what we outline in the report is that it is the responsibility of everyone in a whole range of ways, at the ballot box, in your civil society organizations, through your engagement with political leaders. Everyone has a responsibility and an opportunity to engage on this question of democracy. Second point is, when we do go to the ballot box or mail in our ballots, however that will look come November, I encourage people to think about 3 things. One, those policies which mean the most to us, and each of us choose what those policies are, right? There are millions of policies that presidents make, but most of us choose based on 1 or 2 policies that are most important to us. But there's 2 other factors that matter, I would say, equally to that. One, our democracy needs a president who is deeply committed to strong institutions, to supporting those institutions, and to ensuring that our democracy remains strong, regardless of who's in power, regardless of who wins policy debates. And so thinking about who on that ballot will protect and strengthen our system. And then third is this question, to your point, is American leadership in the world. It's not too late. There are still many countries who are saying we need American leadership. Which candidate will be the one who will lead the world, who will stand up for the values that we have at home, who will see the opportunity to engage internationally as a way to both serve American interests and also global stability, and to stand for these values which are so important and dear to us as Americans. So really thinking about all 3 of those points as we go to the ballot box or the ballot mailbox on in November.
I wouldn't disagree with any of that. The only thing I would add is that it is not just about the White House. Congress plays an enormous role in foreign policy, and in particular on these issues of democracy and human rights. Congress is often leading, and I don't mean exclusively under this president, but under many previous presidents as well. You go back into the debate over, or the issue of apartheid in South Africa, the Reagan administration was very reluctant to put pressure on South Africa, on the white regime there. It was Congress that ramped up the sanctions, got the U.S. into the game, and ultimately helped pressure the government there to change and reform and so forth. Today, Congress has consistently provided more funding than the administration requested for democracy and human rights work around the world. And so it's not just about when you're voting for who's going to be the president, but also who's going to be your senator, who's going to be your representative in the House. Those people have an enormous impact and generally a good impact on this element of American foreign policy.
Great. Well, thank you both for those thoughtful comments. We're going to go to some of the questions that were submitted both before and during this program. One of the pre-submitted questions is, if the number of new COVID cases decreases dramatically in June, the question will be whether this is because the pandemic has been brought under control, or is it because the virus is seasonal? How will the different forms of government respond to preparing or for either possibility?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I am the furthest from being a health specialist, so I can't speak to the health aspects of this. But what I will speak to is this question again of transparency of government. And that is going to be what is going to be most important going forward, is that transparency in government, citizens communicating with government, government responding with good public policies, explaining to citizens in order to build that trust and reaffirm their legitimacy. And I don't know how this will all unfold. I don't know that there are many people who know exactly how this will unfold, but the thing that I will be watching is, do we have government leaders who are transparently communicating, honestly communicating about the number of cases and developing policies which reflect the real concerns and needs of the people on the economic side, on the health side, but they've heard the people and they're responding with effective public policy. And I think that's, again, where we're going to see the democratic process have an opportunity to really function at its best if leaders step into that opportunity.
Yeah, I'm also not a health expert by any means, but I think it's interesting if countries that we thought had sort of licked this, if you look at places like Singapore or South Korea, even China, have already seen sort of modest but important second waves of this coming in. And there, you know, I think in those countries they had built up, citizens had enough trust in the government to know that when the government reimposed some of the restrictions that they had just listed a few weeks earlier, that it was in the public interest, and they've seen good levels of compliance and so forth. So again, it gets to what Nicole was talking about, that relationship of trust, that leaders are transparent and they communicate effectively with people is going to make all the difference if we do indeed see a second wave down the road.
Yeah. And let me just come to that point and build on what Lindsay said. It's a virtuous cycle. When people trust their government, they are willing to take the steps that their government asks of them because they trust that their government is making those decisions in their best interest. I put my seatbelt on and I put my children's seatbelt on because I trust that the government has studied the science behind car accidents and the damage that can happen if you're not wearing a seatbelt. And I limit myself in that way, and I choose to limit my children in that way because I trust the government has thought through this with the experts and that they have made a good policy decision. I will adhere to those policies because I trust in them. And so when that transparency is there, it allows the society to accept short-term limitations or necessary limitations in order to have your own and the society's good advanced.
I guess just a little bit of a follow-up to that. We talk about the, you know, your trust in government. I mean, one of the things that this pandemic has shown is that most of it is very much at the state level, right? Different states are doing different things, and then there's, you know, nationally there's little guidance. I mean, how does that play into this democratic institutions when we're as a country, but within the country right now, we have so many different systems, and it seems like responding to this. Does that, you know, change your analysis of you know, how democracies or how our democracy is functioning right now?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a constant tension in American politics between advocates of the states versus more federal power. I think it's particularly a challenge, though, in you know, your members are there in two different states on two different sides of the river, and what's happening in Indiana may be very different from what's happening in Kentucky, and that poses some real challenges. I think that's one of the reasons you've seen, for example, in the Northeast, there's a compact among, I think it's 7 or 8 states that have come together. You've seen a similar development on the West Coast and a few other places in the country, because we do need to coordinate on something like this. State boundaries are not policed or fenced or anything like that, and many people live in one state and work in another jurisdiction. So that does pose a real challenge. I think, you know, ordinarily federalism, allowing states to innovate, is a very good thing. It's one of the blessings of the American system, that a new policy that's developed in Texas may work okay and one in Minnesota may work better. And to be able to have those laboratories of democracy is generally a very good thing. But this is a tough challenge because the virus knows no borders, you know, whether they be state borders or international borders.
Mm-hmm. And this is where we recognize that this collaborative approach is absolutely necessary. It doesn't mean that everyone has to be involved in every decision, but there has to be that open communication between all levels, both on an international level, but also on the national to state level, and a clear delineation of whose responsibility is what. And it is in a democracy that we see through laws, through our Constitution and through other structures, we see these clear delineations of what power is in different places. And I think that's why in these times of crisis, we see tremendous importance then of having institutions, having structures, and having clear rules and laws in place that can help guide us, because it's not the time that you do these things, that you make them up during a pandemic. And I think this is where strong leadership is needed to articulate what are the things which should be at the national level and what are the things which rightfully should be at the state level, because our governors and our mayors and our town leaders are much closer to the people that they're serving.
Okay. Here's a question about expectations. Do you think the high expectations that Americans hold on democracy may be making them feel that the US government is failing at handling these challenging times, both in terms of the healthcare and the economy?
Mm-hmm. You know, I think we should have high expectations. I'm always a believer in high expectations, but I think we should have a high expectation on how democracy functions, not a high expectation that every single outcome will be immediate and perfect. Because part of the democracy, the structure of democracy is the deliberative process which draws on the wisdom of many parts of our society, many parts of the government, and says we will come out with the best public policy based on that open communication process. And so that's a hard slog to have that public policy. And so our expectations should be on the institutions and our desire and our commitment to ensure those institutions are strong. So our expectations should be on the institutions and that it will ultimately result in an outcome. But we should also know that the expectation is on each of us. We can't sit back, and this is something which is brought out in the report, and say, well, I certainly hope that Washington or the White House or the Congress will deliver everything that I need. Each of us is part of the democratic process of expressing to our local and national leaders what the needs of our communities are, to organize civil society groups, to actively engage in the process, to use our ballot and our email and letter writing campaign process to express our views on what types of public policies we want. So that expectation should also be one that's reflected back to us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Lindsay, do you have anything?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I mean, I obviously agree with that. I mean, I think there's a phrase that's sometimes used in the democracy business, which is about democracy delivering. And it's important that whether, you know, a fledgling democracy in a country that's just coming through a political transition, or an older established democracy like ours is able to deliver results that the citizens want. Not 100% of the time, not without limitations, but that, you know, if you think about it at the local level, you know, that the streets are safe, that the streets are paved, that there are sort of basic services in place, that democracy has to deliver those things. And, you know, we have the great luxury of being able to say, okay, you know, the current mayor hasn't done a good job, so I'm going to vote for his opponent. But it also matters at the national level. You know, can the military keep our country safe? Do we have decent systems of education or healthcare or all these other things? So at the end of the day, democracy has to deliver on what citizens want. We know from polling that those numbers have slipped quite a bit over the last decade or so, that people have lost confidence in Washington or in their state government or even in their municipal government to do that. So it's important to keep that in focus, to remember that our government owes us things in a very real sense. As Nicole said, we need to hold them accountable by voting, but also by, you know, writing a letter to the editor, or, you know, petitioning or protesting, or all those sort of things. Citizens have to be engaged, or government doesn't have to deliver.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions asked about when it comes to supporting democracy and human rights, the U.S. doesn't have a spotless record. How do you reconcile that with supporting democracy overseas?
That's a great question, and I really appreciate it. It's a question which we have heard as we've gone on the road and had this conversation in many cities. It's probably one of the most important questions, because it is also about how much does this actually, how true is this argument? One of the things which we pull out in the report is this idea of humble confidence. The United States can approach this idea of supporting democracy overseas with humble confidence. Humble because the United States has made significant mistakes at home and abroad. And we have to be honest about what has our own domestic history and where our policies overseas have not always aligned with democracy or human rights. But we also can be rock solid confident that those values don't change because of our failure to sometimes live up to them. Those values remain the same. And in fact, as we look back on the civil rights movement, we look on other times in our own country's history, it has been the institutions of democracy and it has been the values of democracy that have moved us out of those times of significant failure to live into them. If you listen to what Dr. King talked about, much of it was talking about the ideals of democracy and pushing the United States to live into those. And I think we have a stronger message as we go overseas to say, hey, we're standing for these values because they are the right values. We're not perfect. We haven't always done it right, but we can tell you that these values are rock solid and we have that confidence going forward.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you know, every president will face trade-offs. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability to remake the world exactly as we'd like it, which means we have to sometimes deal with unsavory governments, unsavory regimes. China is an important part of the global community. We have very complicated, intricate trade relations with them on, on so many other issues. And so we have to deal with them, and that's going to be true of every president. We're never going to have the world look exactly like we would want it to. But at the same time that we're working on trade issues with China, we can also say, hey, we don't approve of the way you're treating the Uyghur minority. We don't approve of the way you're treating people of religious faith, for example. And we can do both. We've done that historically when we were in the middle of the Cold War and we had very important issues to deal with the Soviet Union. We also could say, we don't like the way you're treating Jews in the Soviet Union. And so it's important to live up to those values. And as Nicole says, acknowledging that we are by no means perfect. We are deeply flawed in many ways, but we also aspire to be better.
Great. Well, I'm going to leave you with one more question. I think it seems to be a good wrap up for this conversation. What is the state of democracy in the world today? Where are we? What do you see? And where do you see it going? Nicole, you want to start?
I'll say it's mixed. Let me start with the bad news so I end on the good news. As I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, Freedom House, which is one of the leading non-governmental organizations looking at support for democracy around the world, has reported that we're in our 14th consecutive year of democratic regression, which means that there are more countries that are going backwards or backsliding in their democratic strength than there are ones that are moving forward. This is a real urgent struggle. This is because China and Russia are seeing opportunities to expand their power and expand their models around the world. It is because populist leaders have come to power in many places and started to sow those seeds of doubt in the system itself. It has been because of economic crises and a number of other issues. But I am hopeful through all of this too. And you have to be hopeful because the alternative is to say there is no hope and then we're going to accept that authoritarianism could take over. I have hope because there are people around the world who are in much more difficult situations than most of us in the United States ever will be, who are choosing to choose democracy. People in Venezuela, people in Hong Kong, people around the world are standing up for these values every day and asking that they have democratic institutions, that they have the right to choose their government, that they have the right to worship, to speak, to assemble, to do the things which we do all day, every day, and the right to do that freely. And so I have courage that the people continue to ask for those things, which means that these ideals have not gone away. We just have strong competitors. And so we just have to get in the game and recognize that we just have to continue urgently to push through American leadership, through support of our allies and support for activists around the world, push for the change that's needed.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Just as a very tangible example, this week, Burundi in Africa is holding elections. A strongman has been in power for 15 years. He's stepping down and citizens are going to get to choose a new leader. There are plenty of places where democracy is facing some real challenges, some real trouble, but there are also places like Burundi where, despite a lot of obstacles, citizens are going to go out and vote to choose a new president for their country. And that's something that the U.S. should be encouraging and should be supporting.
Great. Well, thank you both for that really very enlightening conversation. I think we tend to forget, especially these days, the importance of American values in foreign policy. And the World Affairs Council, I mentioned before, we facilitate a lot of exchange programs, and many of them through the State Department. And those are the kind of opportunities where we see bringing people from different countries with different types of living in different types of regimes, and really seeing how democracy play out in the U.S. by traveling to different parts of the states. And that's a really powerful diplomacy tool that we have that unfortunately, you know, it's always a struggle to keep it going, but it's a very, very useful soft power tool, and it really goes along with everything you said. It helps people's perceptions about the U.S. overseas once they've been here. So we hope that's all going to continue. Thank you both so much for joining us, and thanks to everybody else who has stayed on to listen to our conversation today. We're going to be sending a follow-up email with a link to the report that Nicole prepared. It is very well organized and very easy to navigate. I've gone through it with links so you can get to specific sections, very much bullet pointed done, so it's easy to look at. But so I really think that if you can take a look at that, we will send that link to you. And I hope everyone will stay healthy and stay well. And thank you again. Hopefully we'll see more from all of you soon. Thanks, Nicole and Lindsay.
Thank you.
Thank you
Great
for
to be with you.
hosting. Great to be
Absolutely.
with you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
You too.